Hi, Stacy. How are you doing today?
Oh, very good.
Hi, everyone. We have Stacy Juba, my friend, with us today. She is my favorite editor in the whole world. In case anyone's new to the podcast, would you give us a little rundown of who you are?
Yes, I'm a fiction author of mystery and romantic comedy and some young adult books, and I'm also a freelance developmental editor and line editor and the founder of Shortcuts for Writers, where I teach online courses for writers to help them simplify the writing and editing process and fit writing into a busy life.
Yes, which is everything we need, basically. You have an awesome course on like self-editing and getting ready to push out the manuscript, which I think is amazing, and I tell everyone about it. We're going to talk about something else today, but just talking about that course a little bit with editing, like I saw the other day that somebody was like putting out memes, about like editors being all I mean writers being all frazzled because they're editing, or like I hate editing, I hate all the and it's so funny to me, this like journey that we have, right? Of like you get something on the page, and I think what we hate about editing is that we don't really know how to do it. So that's why I like your course, because it goes through a lot of, because it's more than just finding the missing periods, right? It's
Right.
like
It's the big things, the big structural things, down to the word choice and sentence structure, down to the periods and the little
right.
things like that. It's a big, um, all-encompassing endeavor, so you need to have some kind
Yeah.
of system.
Yeah, because I think that helps that you're a developmental editor when you put together that course. It was not just about like, do you have the Oxford comma or not? Like developmental editing. Can you tell us what the difference is with developmental editing? And you also do line editing because you know all your grammar, but there's a big difference.
Right, so developmental editing, and I created the course based on seeing my editing clients make the same kinds of mistakes over and over.
Mm,
I was writing the same kinds of comments in my editorial letters, so that's why I decided to create the course, as a stepping stone to hiring an editor so that they can save some money, um, and submit the manuscript when it's further along. But developmental editing is where you give a broad overview of everything from the structure of the plot and um, is there enough conflict and obstacles and satisfying conclusion, to the character development from the major characters to the supporting characters. Do they have a character arc? Does the reader understand their motivations, to the point of view? Are you getting into the narrator's head um, deeply enough?
mm.
When if you're writing third person, if you're writing first person, are you doing it skillfully so it's not coming across like as a diary?
Yes.
To the dialogue and the pacing, um, the timeline, does everything um,
Right.
add up, that that you're writing it, is it following like a timeline, so that the date, if you say it's on something happened next week, is it really happening next week? Did you like figure out
Yeah.
um how to put this story into a timeline so that readers understand how much time is passing? um and then line editing, which I also go into the course, I also do, is I like line editing because it's very creative. It's different from copy editing. So line editing is more like just punching up sentences to make
Hmm.
them more vivid and to tighten them up, so they're more active than passive. Just kind of make them more colorful.
Yeah.
And I can, when I work on a client's manuscript, I mean, I kind of do like developmental editing and some degree of line editing together, but it depends on how far along the manuscript is. Because obviously, if a more advanced writer submits a manuscript that they've done several drafts and it's further along, then there's less structural issues, and I can, as I'm going along reading it, I can, punch up the word choice and everything, and
Right.
strengthen the sentences. But if it's a beginner writer, where they're gonna have to make a lot of big structural rewrites, like they're not getting in deep enough into their character's point of view. They have a lot of plot holes. Um, the writing's very passive, then obviously doing the line edits would be they would be obsolete because I have to do so much rewriting anyway. So in that
Right.
case, I'll do line editing just as an example. Like this is how you make a sentence more active, or this is an
Yeah.
example of how you're overusing certain words, and we can make it more vivid. And then
Yeah.
copy editing is like the really the nitty gritty Oxford comma kind of
Right.
thing, the grammar and punctuation, and that's the
But it's
last step.
interesting how as writers we seem to think we all go through this, I think. Um, or maybe it was just me, where you start out writing and it takes so much to get that story onto paper that by the time you hit the end, you kind of think you're done. Like maybe there will be, commas and dialogue tags and things. And your first like run through with an editor is just like, oh, it's so eye-opening to be like,
Yeah.
that like everything that's in my head that I thought was on the page is not necessarily clear to anyone else who's not in my own head.
Right. The first editorial letter can be a shock.
Yes,
If
it
you like,
can be, right?
it could be a 10-page single space letter telling you all these different things, and your
Yes.
first reaction could be, "Oh no, how am I
Yes.
gonna pull off a rewrite?"
Exactly. I remember getting my first, and this was in 2001. So, the internet was a baby, and we were all told at that time not to trust it, there's nothing out there that's good. And I mean, things were not blocked off, let's say, things that nobody wants popping up on their screen. And now I look back and somebody was kind enough. I say the word kind now to send me like 5 pages on really telling me why it wasn't good enough yet, but then pointed out the good things about it. But it was so disheartening to me because I thought, oh, I spent like I'm 19 or 20, 21 or something like that. I spent a year and a half. Now
I
you have the
know.
internet, you can go out and find out. Like you said, you put together the course because you kept seeing the same errors. Like we make the same errors, right? We're not alone in
Right.
this. We all tend to think that it's an easier process than it is.
Yeah.
But we're like we could talk about the full structure, but today we're going to talk more about like body language and kind of punching up the sentences like you like to say, which I think is fun. And like punching up the description and emotion. That's a big job to do without like without not I feel like we can either not do it or we become really angsty. So how do we do it without becoming like super dramatic? I've gotten that edit too, way back. Maybe it still happens. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see with the new one. But I remember getting that edit of like, this person's really dramatic. Like, could you notch down on the dramaticism or whatever? Um, and I think that's because I was overly describing every reaction that they might have to something. So,
Right.
what do you think are the misconceptions first of when we're writing and we're trying to get like the story onto the page and the characters' reactions? Um, let's talk about like the misconception of putting too little and then like putting too much.
Yeah, I think, as a writer what your characters are feeling,
Good point.
and you have a tendency to, like, write that in dialogue, but it's hard for the reader to understand, where that character is coming from. Why are they saying that? Why are they getting, um why are they reacting that way? Or it like either like you might not have, like, if you're your narrator, you might not have gotten into their head enough, or so when they have like this big explosion like of yelling at someone, we're like, where did that come from? Because
Yeah.
it's just um you didn't describe it enough, like how they
Okay.
were feeling. Or a lot of times I'll see a lack of kind of body language and nonverbal communication and details in a scene where that's a dialogue scene where there's a few different characters.
Mm,
Writers have a tendency to make it very dialogue heavy, and we're not seeing as much of like the what is the character doing before they say the dialogue, or in the case of the narrator, what is the narrator thinking, or you know if they getting a if they feel like the anger rising in them, and if someone's embarrassed, like their face is like pinkening or, turning a shade of pink, just little hints to show what the characters are feeling.
Right.
Um, so you need to learn how to like weave that in to your scene, in a fresh and unique way. Because the other problem is that we have a tendency to see the same words over and over again.
Yes. We do latch on to certain words, don't we,
Yeah.
when we're writing?
Well, there's a couple things. Like first, it's beginner writers have a tendency to just tell us how the character is feeling rather than showing us. So it could be like he looked mad, or he looked embarrassed, or she felt is another word, like she
Mm.
felt scared, or she felt a little uneasy. So telling us rather than showing us. But and then the other component is the repeating of like these same words throughout the manuscript. Like I actually created a looks and gazes guide for writers, a free guide, because the number one overused word I see in manuscripts is look. Like she looked at him, he looked at her, she looked upset, he looked mad,
Yep.
and she looked up, she looked down, he gazed at her, she gazed at him, and that's just not very fresh writing, and if you have a tendency to, if you submitted like 5 pages to an editor and they told you you overused a word like look in those 5 pages, you're probably doing it through the whole manuscript. So if you did a search for
Oh.
that word, you're probably going to find that you used it like 300 times.
Oh, geez.
Or another popular one is eyes, she looked into his eyes. He
Yep.
gazed into her eyes. She lowered her eyes. So you want to, and there's nothing wrong with like using eyes or using look sometimes, but you don't want to overdo it. And you want to make sure you're not just relying on like one or two aspects of body language and just overlooking everything else, or nonverbal communication, because there's other emotion categories you could draw upon
Yeah.
when you're writing. So, just becoming more aware of that.
Yes. And I think that takes a lot of it takes work, like working with editors, right? People who are a little more advanced, people who aren't in your own head, so they're really reading it like you're reading it, coming at it fresh, like you don't know anything about it. You're reading it like a reader would. And if the reader doesn't understand, like they don't see what we see in our head. And I remember some of the best advice was like from this one editor who was kind enough to read at least the first 30 pages or so, and then immediately knew, because she was a professional, what was wrong with the book. And it was, she said, you cannot give us every description of what's going on with your characters. You have to allow and let go and let the reader fill in the blanks. And that was really eye-opening to me, because I thought that what I was reading when I read good books with good description
Mm,
was full description, but what I was doing was filling in the blanks. And she
right.
told me, go back and read books that you love and realize that they have very few description, and your brain, your imagination is taking off. So it's interesting how then when you start to write, you think you have these weird misconceptions, right? Of like what you should be writing, or even what you have read.
Right. Right. You tend to, exactly what's going on in the scene as you're writing it, but your readers might not, make the same connection. So it's like you don't want to, like you were talking before about overdoing it, like it's like the
Okay.
same, you don't want to overdo it either. You do want to let readers kind of fill in some of those blanks, so you don't have to um like one thing I noticed is that once writers become more aware of nonverbal communication, the importance of weaving it in, they start stringing together a lot of nonverbal communication in one paragraph, like you
Oh, like
know,
what?
like
Maybe I do
like
this.
think off the top of my head, yeah. Like if someone was nervous, they'll kind of go
Oh,
overboard
they'll
with
be like, their
describing it.
palms started being
Yeah,
sweaty and their knees were shaking. And yes, I have done
yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
have done
So
that as well. I went way overboard.
yeah, they just take too many of those nonverbal cues and put them together. And I was like, okay, we got the point. We don't have
Yes.
to, maybe two of those would work, but we don't need like five of those cues in the same paragraph, because then that's just telling the reader, hey, did you get the point? She's nervous. Did you get that?
Right.
So like you were saying, you also you want to show it, but you don't have to go on and on about it, because the reader is going to get the
Get bored.
message as yeah. If you go too overboard with it, they can make, okay, yeah, I got it. She's nervous. Let's just get on get on with
Right.
the scene.
That's a good
So
point. And I guess that's what I kind of call the angstiness of like over dramatizing is that even a word? I don't know. Um,
and sometimes I think like with the angstiness, like writers kind of go overboard with the dialogue,
oh, okay.
where they'll just go on where instead of saying like she felt sad or something, she'll just say it in the dialogue. It should just it'd be like a long, almost
Especially if it's
telling.
first person, right? Like I feel
Yeah, or just kind of telling the other person, like, I'm so sad, and this is what, and it's really, even though it's in dialogue, she's still really just telling the reader, it's not coming across as the reader isn't really feeling it, that, oh, she's so, not really. And I think that's the thing, you want to make an emotional connection with your reader so that they can kind of feel what your character is feeling and relate to them, and be like, okay, well, that's why she's reacting this way.
right.
But if you just go on and on, like, oh, I'm so sad, and this, I'm so, she did this, you just go on and on in dialogue, it can come across as angsty,
Yeah.
and and it can actually have the opposite effect of having your reader get frustrated, like, with the character, because she comes across as like too much, and we
Too
don't
much.
too much, and we don't really understand. It's different if we can, like, if it's your narrator, we can get into her head, and and somebody says something, and it just, maybe somebody gives her like a criticism, and it's just like she gets a sharp pang of, or it reminds her of something, or it reminds her of when her mother used to criticize her, or
Right.
so we have that context of why she's reacting this way, and then it just becomes more three-dimensional and believable, where if it's just kind of thinly portrayed, and it's a lot of angst in the dialogue without the context, and
Yeah.
then it can just be harder for the readers to relate to your characters, because they're not really connecting on an emotional level. You're just kind of telling rather than showing.
Yes, I think that's a really good point though, because if they can relate it back to why they're acting like that, like, and weaving in that backstory a little bit of like, I don't know, this will probably be bad, but John said it was becoming more critical with old age, just like her father used to constantly pick on her mother's, you know, blouse unbuttoning at the top or something, like that sort of bringing back the backstory of why that would bother someone so much is so much more personal, because you start thinking like, oh, I know what that person's like, like that's just like Uncle Joe who would constantly complain about everything. Or that's much more like that's much more grounding for the reader, I feel like, and much more personal, because it where our minds are weird, they can think of like 50 things at once as we're reading. Uncle Joe can pop up, or grandpa, or whoever who was critical, or maybe nice or whatever, and you'll actually have like a sweet or weird memory while you're reading it, because the writer has really brought in the fullness of life, right? The fullness of like the richness of what it is to be human. Like I'm reading Louise Erdrich's book. I think that's how you say her name, The Sentence. And there was one really beautiful line where she's talking about one person, but she had already introduced another character. And so she's talking about this one young man there, and she says, who's there to study the Ojibwe language, and she says who Penn, the other character she had already introduced, both admired and resented. And it's like it's a really short sentence, but it makes you like think back to the other character, and it gives you more insight into how complicated relationships are, right? And humans. And it just like added another dimension to both of these these characters. And it was like this long,
Right. And
it's
just like,
really cool.
and even like if you have a scene where it's going to escalate into anger, where they
Mm,
have like this outburst, if you can just weave in a little bit of the nonverbal communication cues so you can see it building, like it's the um somebody's, like the thing is, you can't get into every character's head. You don't want to head
yeah.
hop into what they're thinking or what their backstory is. So you can do that for your narrator of that scene, but for the other characters, you've got to rely on like what your narrator is observing them do.
Right.
So it can be like, there's different categories of nonverbal communication. So I mean, we already talked about the eyes and the eye contact, but then there's like their facial expressions, is the jaw clenching, or they like, a frown deepening,
Yeah.
or the biting the lip, like movement, is someone like showing dominance by kind of moving forward and like, stalking forward and like looming over them, or is somebody feeling like, I don't know, like defensive, like their arms are crossed, like touch, like if you shook someone's hand, is it like a firm
Mm,
handshake, or is it like, I think we talked
limp.
about clammy, limp,
Oh, clammy is a good word.
sweaty, because that implies like nervousness or
Right.
uneasiness without, coming out and saying, oh, he looks nervous. The reader just gets that from the
Right.
limp, clammy handshake.
Yeah,
You
gross.
know, to get, like the gestures, like if someone is, you know, getting mad, you might see like their hands tightening, or at their sides. If they're impatient, like they could be kind of drumming their fingers on the table, or foot can be kind of tapping up and down. Um, the way your characters, like their sits and holds himself with like their postures, is it someone who's just like really casual, just kind of, you know, saunters into the room and straddles the chair and,
Yeah.
or they someone who, who's like kind of slouching as they're, feeling like they're being reprimanded or criticized, and their shoulders are, kind of slumping. This is, it's someone interested in like leaning forward and the seat wants to hear the next word, or they just look, you know,
A
like they're not even
teenager's trying to
listening
put their
for,
earbud in.
yeah. Or glancing down at the phone, at the
Like
phone.
trying not to roll
So
their eyes. That's so what's interesting about that is it gives you said that the narrator, so when you're talking from the hat, let's think of a romance, I guess, and maybe he's talking, one of the romantic, and we'll just say him. So what you're saying, like especially for new writers, like he can't tell the reader what she's actually feeling, right? He can only say what's happening that he can see physically. Like
right.
let's say they're having a conversation, so he can't say she felt this way or she was thinking she thought something,
Right. Like, I
because
mean,
I do see that.
yeah, like your narrator can, you can get into your narrator's head, like if you're having like a scene of dialogue or something, you can, like we were talking before, you could have them remember something,
Right.
or they react a certain way because it triggered some kind of, it just triggered something, an emotional trigger for them. You can get into like the physiological things, like their stomach, like, um just getting queasy, or that they can feel the heat like rushing up to the back of their neck.
Right.
But you can't, for the other characters, um you can't say how they're feeling, because we're not in their
Right.
head. We have to stay close in your narrator's head, so it's like what your narrator is observing.
Right.
So I'll see this mistake a lot, where the writer will sort of unintentionally head hop, by
Mm-hmm.
saying that, even like for the narrator, they'll say like her face reddened, but the
Right.
narrator can't see
Can't
her
see
own
it.
face reddening. She can see everybody else's faces reddening, but she can't see
Right.
her own. So she can, feel the
She
heat
can feel
creeping
heat.
up,
Right.
um,
That's a
so it's
common
that kind of
mistake
thing.
though,
It
right?
is,
Like
yeah,
especially in the beginning. And have also seen like the person might stalk off, and then suddenly the writer is writing about what that person sees, but they haven't changed scene. So the person who's still narrating is still in the house, let's say, and the person, the other person stomps out the door and down the stairs and past the tree. It's just like, well, how are they seeing that? Are they at the window watching them? Then we need to know that they're at the window. So it's these easy mistakes to make because you as the writer see it all, right? Like you're
right.
really in, like it's like an aerial view of this whole movie in your head.
Right. Because like sometimes I'll see in a scene where like the character actually turned around or something, but then she'll like observe that the other person's eyes like widened or something, and then I'll kind of put in my track changes. Well, how can she see her eyes widen when she's turned around? When she's facing the other way, so she can't see.
Yeah.
But so it's like you have to, and it's tricky as a writer, you have to like really visualize it as a movie in your
Yes.
head. And sometimes that just doesn't come through on the first draft because you're just trying to get it down, understandably. And the first draft doesn't have to be perfect. But the problem is like when you send the early draft to an editor and you're paying someone hundreds of dollars to edit like an early draft, there's a lot of mistakes. You can, if you know what to look for, you can catch them yourself so that you can
Right.
save your money and get a, a edit on a work that's much more further along.
Right.
So the body language and the nonverbal communication is just something, every writer needs to pay attention to when they're
Yes.
in the editing process, even if you just want to get the scene down fast while you're writing, and that's fine, but you have to come back to it and really do a editing pass in your book, just looking for the body language and are you showing rather than telling? Do we understand why these characters are acting this way? Do you have a good balance of these different elements? Like are we getting into your narrator's head? Is there a balance of sort of like what they're thinking, what they're feeling physiologically? Are people just always looking at each other and their eyes meeting, or are you, you know, um, varying that and using like gestures and head movements and posture and,
Right.
how they're sitting and standing, facial expressions.
Right.
And I think to just read some good books that, and really observe how other authors are doing it, really successful authors. Um, Now, with that said, I've read a few traditionally published books lately, like that you could tell were just kind of churned out because I was kind of appalled at like how
Oh,
every
often.
page with like the first chapter was like she looked at him, he looked, and the
Now you
authors,
can't not see it,
yeah, I
right?
can't, no, and I was like, oh my gosh, how did this, but it was a big name author who has several books coming out a year, and I guess,
Oh, they just missed
but
it.
I think they just didn't. They were just trying to get it out, and people
Yeah.
bought it. It was like this cozy mystery series that that has a lot of fans. And I think the earlier books in the series they spent much more time on and were much more well developed.
Huh.
And then the later books, the writing just kept, and the editing and I think that's the thing about editing is that a lot of traditional publishers don't have as much time to spend on editing as they did in the
Right.
past. So, if you're a big name author with, tons of books out, maybe you can get away with that because you have fans. But if you're you know, most of us can't get away with that. And,
Right.
right, you know, you really have to have like fresh writing and try to
Yes.
and see these things for yourself. So like read a manuscript that, read a book that you really enjoy and, that's getting a lot of positive reviews and um, by established authors and really observe how they're doing the body language and nonverbal communication and internal thought. Um, and you're sure they can look at each other and it's fine for them to, you know, gaze
But
into
maybe
Judith's
once or
eyes.
twice,
Yeah,
not
but
like a
but you're gonna
hundred.
right, but you're gonna see a lot of just really nice turns of phrases like, oh wow, what a fresh way to say that, or what a unique way to convey that same, that same kind of thing. It's just see the twist they put on it, and sort of just, let
Yeah,
yourself really just be creative as you're writing. And, if you see yourself writing something that's kind of cliched, um, just again, like pretend like you're watching a movie, like what's a fresh way to just describe
right.
it. And
What else can
um,
I say about that moment other than my her hands were sweaty again? Because it is true that the we tend to get into this, I don't know why, but we trip into the same phrases or the same gestures or whatever. Even, 4, 5, 6, 7 books down the road, for some reason when you're just in the book, you just you end up saying the same thing over and over again. So like you said, like sit back and think, okay, where are they? But you really have to have a pretty critical editorial eye at that point. You can't just be the writer at that point. You really have to be looking and thinking critically of like, what else can I do to deepen this story, and maybe have her observe something else, or remember a memory or a backstory, but like not sweating palms again. Like what
right,
else could I do? What other senses could I use?
right,
um and yeah, reading other books, I mean, I going back to, it's the one book I'm reading right now. The sentence, her husband, like, the character rubs his hands together and puts his hands on her face, and she said she leaned into the warmth of his hands, and like, that's not it's not saying she felt secure, she's not saying that, but that's the sensation you get, not just because of that sentence, but because of the surrounding sentences as well, right? Like the dialogue that they're having, he's reassuring her, then he puts his hands on her face and she leans into it, and you understand as the reader that she feels safe with this man, because somebody else could put their hands on your face and it's a threat,
right,
like understanding that these a gesture doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? It's
right.
whatever you've put around it.
I mean,
Shrugging can be
right.
perceived as many things.
Right, you could just, like, not know, you could be kind of bored, or, like, you'd be like, I don't care," annoyed, or, it's so,
Right.
I think, like, another thing to do is just, like, observe people, keep a
Okay.
journal, like, of just watch what people do when in different
Yeah.
situations, like,
I
just,
like that.
you know, if you're, like, in a coffee shop or something, just, like, watch people and how they act, listen to conversations, and even how your friends and family just pay more attention, like,
Right.
as to what, and that can inspire you to, to come up with new ways of, like, describing things. And a couple of authors that I think do down for book communication well are like Jodi Picoult, like someone like that, who just writes these, she's writes these really intense, like in-depth stories about all kinds of, really original subjects. So I think her writing is really original. So you could, like, read someone like her. I've been reading a lot of Leanne Moriarty lately.
Okay.
Just try some different authors even outside your genre to kind of mix it up a little bit, and
Oh,
see
yeah.
how they're describing things, and just become more aware of it, and become more aware of what your crutches are, like, you know what are the phrases, and that you tend to overuse the most, and just become more aware of
Yes.
them, like eyebrows. I see a lot of eyebrows raising, and
Do you?
eyebrows are yeah. Every writer has their like phrases that they kind of go back to again and again, and
Well, it's
but
interesting how we kind of suddenly make our characters like trained psychologists almost. And I think it goes into, we really are intimate with all the characters, or we should be as the writers, right? But whenever I'm talking to any of my writing clients, it's like, well, why would they know that that's what they're doing, or like, why, half the time we don't know what we actually feel, until it's like, let's lead up to like a big blowout. You don't start out like super, super, super angry. You start out frustrated, and then another scratch comes, and then another, and then like this, and everything starts falling apart, or like, and so like making our characters so in tune with their own emotions and everyone else's emotions is just unrealistic, right? Like it
Right.
has, they have to have observances that aren't always correct almost, or like, or they just can't be super deep all the time. Like that would be
Right.
really annoying to be friends with that person.
Right. I mean, you can't, yeah, your characters have to be flawed too, and they can't like, you know, like this. Well, he said that to me because, well, he's got, he's got like rejection issues or something, or you don't want your character like psychoanalyzing everybody. I'm not sort of psychologist, but yeah, like just I think just coming at it from like looking at your own life and the people and how everybody has like this different perspective. Like two people could just have this totally different perspective, and that's why they're arguing, because
Right.
they they both have experiences that shape them. They both have sort of like trigger points that, like maybe one person feels, gets defensive because, it just sort of always feels like people don't listen to her, and the other one could have a history of like being criticized, or just like takes anything as criticism, and then when you put those
Right.
personalities together, they're gonna clash. So the characters might not be aware of you know, why they're reacting this way, because they don't understand the other person's perspective,
Right.
but
That's
you as the
important.
writer can sort of think about that as, as you're writing the book and before you write the book, and, do some research into different personalities, types and archetypes.
Yes.
And I know you've talked a lot about this kind of thing, like, and, there, I think people have like positive or different personality types have like positive traits that, and
Right.
then they also have sort of negative traits
Hmm.
associated with them. Like if, I don't know, like if someone, I'm trying to think of an example, like someone is like really nurturing. You could have like
Hmm.
another character who's like very nurturing. So the positive aspects of that character, that she's, she'll do anything for you, and she's really, really protective. The negative aspects is that she could be too overprotective and annoy
Right.
people, like annoy her kids, annoy her husband. Like she could
Right.
be too, maybe she's too controlling,
Right.
because she just wants, she just wants to take care of them and wants them to be safe, but she's like, you know, you kind
Like
of
going
discouraging them
overboard.
from what they want to do,
Yes,
like they,
especially if the other character is like more of an independent and now they don't understand each other and she thinks
right,
she's being disrespected and the kid thinks she's being smothering or whatever. Yeah. That
right,
I do you see that quite often where they just sort of have a character reaction? Like I always like to use James Bond because he's not very conscientious. He's not very emotionally attached, let's say. And then all of like you have that sort of character who when a woman bursts into tears will like then have compassion and hug her and you're like no. That doesn't work. You have to continue with your character even as they're learning, right? But they can't do like a 180-degree turn on how you've set them up in the beginning, right? Or like
right,
suddenly in a fight they're still, even if are becoming more balanced, they're still going to react how their personality is. Like a nurturing person isn't going to suddenly like, well, I'll abandon everybody because nobody wants me to do anything anymore. I mean, a crisis mode, they're still going to react exactly as they are, right? They're going to go
right.
mother hen. So do you see that a lot where people sort of aren't consistent then with the characters? Is that
Yeah, they're not consistent because they didn't really decide early on, like
a good one?
exactly what the dominant traits
Right.
are, and then, or they just change too drastically, like at the end. I mean, you definitely want the character to grow and evolve, and but maybe you don't, everything about them isn't going to change. What do you want to focus on? Like, what's their
Yeah.
character arc? What is the, what, how do you want them to evolve in the book? So they're not going to become another totally different person, you
Right.
know. Um, and you have to kind of build up to whatever the change is going to be. You have to build up to that, and then some manuscripts, like by beginner authors, you don't see that build up. It's just,
Yeah.
they got from point A to point C, but point B is kind of
Right.
muddled about
Oh, that's a good analogy.
how
Yeah.
they got there. And I think a lot of times that's just like the lack of clarity when you're writing about
Okay.
what your character's personality traits are. So I think, I mean, I like to do, like when I'm writing a book, I do a lot of free writing from the character's point of view, just kind of like journaling, like, tell me about yourself, or tell me what bothers
Yep.
you, what,
Yeah.
or what makes
Sounds
you
weird
sad.
to
It sounds
non-writers, right?
weird, but yeah. um, and
And
then
writing their trigger points, I love writing. What is the
yeah,
story behind the trigger point? Like, why does she no longer trust men? What happened?
right.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes it can just be helpful to look through books of like archetypes or personality types, and looking at the positive and negative traits associated with them. Like another thing, like I'm interested in astrology, and there's a
Yeah.
astrologer I follow who talks, Deborah Silverman, and she's kind of interesting because she always talks about um even looking at like the different signs, like how
Okay.
they have like characteristics associated with them, and she'll talk about like the high road of that sign, the low road, which is the same kind of thing, like
Right.
like a Cancer, like who's someone who's like, I'm a Cancer, someone who's like, again, like the nurturing and homebody and likes to take care of people, but then the low road of it might be like being too, never wants to leave the house, never
Yeah.
wants to do it, that kind of thing. Or
Right.
so it's just think about whatever personality traits, wherever you get that inspiration, whether it's like from astrology, whether it's from archetypes or
Yep.
personality books, wherever you get that inspiration. Think about what the high road of that trait is, and the low
Good
road,
point.
like, and then that will drive like how your character reacts in different situations, and then that will drive like what kind of nonverbal communication and body language your characters can use.
Right.
So I think it's just helpful to think about all of that, before you start writing the book, or if you're already writing the book, then just kind of stop and think, okay, what am I trying to get across with this character's personality, and how does it come into conflict with this character's personality? Why is this character, you know,
True.
um, acting this way? And just really think about that, and then that'll help you get a better understanding of them. Because if you're kind of vague in your mind about, their personalities, it's hard to make the reader really understand, because if you don't understand it,
Right.
the reader's
Yes.
not
The
gonna.
reader's not going to.
Yeah,
Right.
so
That's so
you,
true.
right, so you have to understand it as the author, why they're doing these things and why they're acting that way. And even though your characters obviously aren't going to be like psychoanalyzing each other,
Yeah.
you're deliberately putting them in these situations, and because this is the way you created them, and you're deliberately having them act this way because you've created these personalities for them, and and your job is to show it to the
Yeah.
reader without just telling them like, oh, this is why she did this, or banging them over the head with it, like going, overboard. You just have to weave in these reactions,
Right.
with the dialogue and the story you're telling.
Yeah. So sometimes when you get to the end, you know them so much better, which means you have to go back to the beginning,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then just probably rewrite it. And I have found as a writer, sometimes the beginning scenes, they just don't work. They were just kind of exploring the character at some point, and they're just not going to work because of who they've really become. So
right,
they need to, then you just sort of have to chalk it up to practice and write
yeah,
a different scene, right?
right.
And all of that's going to help you. It's just going to make the book so much better. It's going to connect with the reader. Um, better, and people are going to love it more and buy the next book, right? So can you talk to us about this writing toolkit? Like, what can people expect? I mean, you have so many different options, and we'll have all the links in the show notes below, but you have a writing toolkit that is really created to help writers. Like, I mean, what we talked about is a lot, right? Like, okay, now you guys expect me to go back through my manuscript to remember everything you said. So you create things just like the editing course for writers to like not have that overwhelm. So what is
Right.
in this toolkit? Our
So it's
tool belt
called
as writers.
the Energize Your Writing Toolkit: Cheat Sheets for Character Emotions. And the early uh, the early draft of this was something years ago I kind of created for myself, because this was
Okay.
nonverbal communication was always an area that I found challenging as a writer, and so I would kind of like, I'd like brainstorm different ways to express like anger or arrogance or boredom, things like that. And I
Yeah.
made myself these cheat sheets just
Okay.
so that like as I was going, I'd write my scene and then I'd kind of be like, okay, I want to go back and pump up the scene a bit. And I'd go through my list of prompts, and that would just kind of get my memory and my
Right.
inspiration going. So that's why I created it initially for myself. And then once I became an editor and I was working with a lot of clients, and I saw that it wasn't just me. It was like everybody's,
Which is
they're all
nice.
having, yeah, okay, they're all having the same issue. I'm seeing these same um issues on like almost every manuscript I'm editing. So that's why I expanded the toolkit. It's a mini course, but it includes like 100-page PDF, and it talks about nonverbal communication, what is body language, and gives a lot of examples. And then it's broken down by category.
Oh, wow.
So there's different categories like anger and arguments, like annoyance and frustration, like compassion, confidence, contemplation. I'm like reading some from from the
Yeah.
table of contents, like excitement, fear, happiness, and it's just different ways to express those
Yes.
emotions. So you can either like, you can just kind of copy and paste some of the prompts, but I encourage you to use it as inspiration, just to get your brain thinking of like, oh, okay, I could say it that way, or I could say it this way. It just kind of gets your brain thinking. It's like it has you focusing on this, like, okay, this is what I want to show. I want to show she's embarrassed. I want to show like he's afraid. But instead of just like kind of, when you're writing or editing, you're floundering, like, okay, I want to show he's afraid, but how can I'm getting a little stuck. I can't think.
Yes.
But you refer to the pages on fear, and it's broken down into different ways. Some of the gestures like touch, facial expressions, eyes and eye contact, different ways you can show fear through those kinds of emotional prompts. So
Right.
it gets your mind, it just kind of gets you focused on that, and then it can make it easier. A lot of people have said it just, they refer to it all the time because it just they don't have to like remember all the
Right.
common reactions to
It's
like
so
fear,
true.
or like lying, or if somebody's feeling relieved. I have pages on that. Like they don't have to remember like all the ways that the little tells that people might have if they're lying, that they can just look at this and be like, oh yeah, they might do that, or do
Right.
this, and
Yes.
like, how can I maybe put that into context, use like some of the details of my scene and setting, and how can I even put a special spin on that, or you know yeah, so that's basically what it is. And then I have some like videos that shows how to use it, and then a lot of different bonuses like cheat sheets on um you know um developing your character, and
Hmm.
like a little some like color wheels that have like the different emotional categories, so you can kind of keep it near you as you're
Oh, cool.
writing, just to kind of jog your memory, so you don't have to remember
Yes.
all the different categories of nonverbal communication. So
Right.
yeah.
And remember how many different emotions humans have? Because
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes we get stuck happy, sad, angry. I don't know. Like the different and remembering that they're supposed to be emotional, right? So that like sometimes I write a scene, I'm like, what is their emotion in this scene? Maybe we should go back and put an
Yeah.
actual emotion in. Like, yeah, sure, sometimes we can just be like, okay, flatline, but probably not a whole book. That's probably
Right.
not good.
And
So,
I encourage, if you, even though it's like a sort of like a reference book, I encourage people, like I have on like on like on the left side of every page, with the prompts, it's like a list the different prompts and the different subcategories for that emotion. But on the right side, it's blank lines. So I
oh,
encourage people to like print it out, put it like in a binder or something, and then add to it.
oh, cool.
If you're
Okay.
like reading a book and you saw it like a really fresh way, somebody describe something, write it down. And not that you're going to use that or copy it, but just like, oh, that it's just for inspiration,
Right.
to just to kind of to increase your awareness of all the creative ways you can express, have your characters express these emotions and show how they're feeling. So you just, or sit down and like, right, one day just sit down and brainstorm, like, okay, this is Stacy's list of like for showing like the romance and attraction, showing like chemistry between people. Let me like brainstorm a list of my own. And I'll write it.
Yeah.
And that way you just have, it's just, you're always adding to it. And so you'll just have this great reference thing that you can pull out as you're editing, or if you're stuck on a scene.
Right.
And it just becomes
You don't go
your
down the
own.
Google rabbit hole.
Right. You just kind of make it your own. Like, I give
Yeah.
you a starting point with a lot of, I think I have like more than, I don't know, 4,000 prompts
Oh
or
my
something like
gosh.
that. So I give you a good starting point, but now you make it your own, you add to it, and then take some emotions might be harder for you to show than
Right.
others. You might be like a romance writer and you're great at writing like the romance scenes and the romance and attraction, but you have trouble writing like the argument scenes or something like
Right.
that. So, just becoming aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then trying to build that list of, so it's like a cheat sheet that you can
Yeah. Or
refer
like you
to.
said, go out and observe people. My
Yeah.
favorite is to take a walk and listen to couples. That's what I'm doing. And sometimes I'm like, wow, they're mad at each other.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's the writer in me.
Right. And
But
how
then
are
it
they
makes me
showing
think,
it?
how
Yeah.
can I
Like,
add that?
yeah, go write it. I'm gonna go pull up my binder and I'm gonna write what she
Like with my pen and paper, like, look at how she did that. I see that, you know.
yeah.
But that's great. I mean, this is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to capture the human essence of different things, and we can't hold everything in our head. I think a cheat sheet is great because it will help. It kind of helps the writing go faster. A, I don't want to go down the Google hole when I'm trying to write, and B, sometimes my brain just gets stuck.
Yeah.
I need to pull this out of, my binder and look at it. And it has helped me, honestly, to remember how many different emotions there are and to actually think when I pull out your cheat sheet, it's like, okay, he's afraid, but he's actually not going to admit that he's afraid. And so that might come out as shame. Like he's like ashamed of being afraid. And so like how could I show, the reader's going to realize he's probably afraid, but like what's his personality? And so I sort of look over that, and that might take me like 5 minutes instead of going down the Google rabbit hole. It'd take me 3 hours, right? And then and like, okay. And it really does when you're still thinking about your story, right? So you're not outside of your story anymore. You're still thinking about your characters. I find that I then can get out like 500, 1,000 words, no problem, because I haven't left that story. I haven't gone down, oh, look at this new disease they have on the sideline of the Google thesaurus that I'm looking at. So, this is not just like it won't take you out of the story, is what I'm trying to say. When you pull out these cheat sheets, it's still part of writing. It's still part of that process, right? Of your editing and you're in it and you're just like getting deeper. And it's just all part of learning to become a better writer, I think, for
Right.
you.
Just helping you to focus on this area more. And even
Yeah,
it sounds like a small thing like the nonverbal communication and body language, but it really, it makes you think about the bigger thing is why are they doing that,
right.
and help you just to, flesh out your characters and, make sure that you understand their motivations. And then, okay, so that's why they're acting like this way. And this is how some ways I can show it on the page to the
Yeah.
reader.
Yes,
Um,
I love that. So we're going to have the links in the show notes below, as well as links to finding all things about Stacy Juba and her courses. And thank you so much, Stacy, for coming and talking to us today about nonverbal communication.
Thank you. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.